Hey everyone, welcome to episode 17 of the LatinX Point of View podcast. I'm Leo Scarpati, and this week, returning once again, is my co-host, Gina Esquivel. Gina, you were missed last week in our conversation, but I'm so glad you're back today. Gina, we've been looking at a way to talk about this topic for a long time. We were thinking of different ways to include how birth rates are being affected in the United States, how we're looking at pregnancy, in the overall spectrum. Share with us a little bit about why you're passionate about this topic and kind of what made you say, hey, let's talk about this.
Hey. First of all, thank you for such a warm welcome. I went to a working vacation and unfortunately ended up injuring my elbow.
Oh no.
Overworking it. Yeah. But hey, yeah, that's all my elbow, so I can still get all the things done. And one of the things that following up on your question of why this topic is so interesting. So I have been hooked to this program that is called Handmaid's Tale. The show itself is a story of a woman who was kidnapped or abducted into this very dictator style government. In the future, the way that they design kind of like the storyline in a hypothetical way. So the U.S. Government is overthrown by this very conservative party that believes that fertility has to be managed and has to be ordered. So they create this state where women who are fertile have to be, cannot have children by their own. They have to be mandated within a household to have it. And women who don't and can't have children are pretty much part of a working force that it resembles a lot of slavery. So this show, there's some reaction in the feminist platform because it really tells you what would look like not only if women were to lose their ground as the equal rights, but if the government was intentional about managing fertility and what does that do to the women. And so this show is not for the faint of heart because it's very raw, it's very cruel in a lot of ways. But to me, I love it because it just brings these social extremes to the picture where you've never contemplated, but there is a way that sometimes what you see in the media in the latest days, it will say, what if we go this way, we may end up just like that. And it's not something that it can't happen. It definitely can happen. It may be already a show and tell that it could be brewing in the background. We never know those things. So to me, there is this conversation that we should be having about fertility and to be more intentional about it. And I love to be able to have a conversation in these 30 minutes on the topic. What do you think? Do you think we can do this?
I think we can do it. I find it a very fascinating topic. I didn't know that that's where your idea had come from. I've heard of the show and I've never kind of dived into it. I'm a big TV buff and there's a lot of things that's on the streaming platforms now that I've been watching and that my wife and I watch together. And this is something that's piqued my interest, but I've kind of never jumped into it. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And you never know, I might start watching this week. But on that note, I want to take a quick break and then let's get into the conversation after this break.
LatinX Point of View is brought to you by Civic Canvas, a bilingual boutique firm designing strategies for social change. To learn more at civiccanvas.com.
So part of this topic, what got me thinking, and it's just kind of, gave me some food for thought, is how do we in the U.S. approach this topic of fertility or birth? And having worked in the social landscape for many, many years, it is obvious that their culture and our religion has a big, big influence in how we perceive birth. And I used to work doing HIV prevention. And so we had to talk a lot about safe sex and unwanted pregnancies, et cetera, et cetera. And that, it always sparked my interest because how people see having a child as a blessing. So different countries approach it different. If you have to look back, for example, China has an population overgrowth that is quite significant. And so their approach and control of fertility is very, very rigid. Though in the United States, we're still at, a free state. You have your kids, as many as you want to, and you have a lot of freedom. There's some religion that I think, depending on where you are, that prohibits you or prevents you to have to, actually, that it will encourage you to have as many children as you want. Particularly for Latinos and some other groups that I've met, having a child is a blessing from God, and it doesn't have to do anything with economics or family growth or family composition. It's just like, if he came, it's because God wanted me to. And, on the other side, you still have birth control as part of your unwanted pregnancies and people having children that they don't intend to. So there is this dichotomy of, I want to have children, and then I didn't mean to have this child, to people that actually may have to reconsider based on their resources. Because of financial constraints, they may not feel that they could have as many children, and so they're planning how many they will want. And of course, there is, when you are looking at the entire population growth, you have to think, is there enough space for all of us? Not just today, but is there enough space for all of us in the future? And how much the consumption of resources, natural resources, happen with the population growth? In United States being already a high consumer, the highest consumer of natural resources in the world. So yeah, it kind of makes you think, should we really regulate? And if we regulate, do we want to, and how do we? But in general, what do you think about the culture and religion piece, Leo?
Well, the first example that you gave about China I thought was interesting, because China for many years had a rule where families could only have one child per family, unless it was a boy, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. But I know they just recently, in the last maybe 5 years or so, expanded it to families having 2 children per family. So we see a government-run or a state-run country dictating how many children families can have. Now, I don't know how they control that. For me, it would be interesting to see, because just like in most countries, you do have other rural parts, and how do you dictate that in more rural parts where you don't have that strong presence of government? So to me, that would be interesting. One of the things that you talked about was overpopulation, and I thought to myself, man, there's a lot of land out there. So when we're looking at overpopulation, are we talking about overpopulation in urban settings? Because in the U.S., we do see an overpopulation, or what feels like an overpopulation, in our metropolitan areas. But there's still a large part of rural America that is out there, and we keep seeing these communities becoming smaller and smaller every year. So when we talk about resources, when we talk about impact, are most of our resources being funneled into our larger urban metropolitan areas? And could we spread some of these resources out to some of those outlying communities to where we make the rural part of America function again? Mm-hmm. But I guess the conversation turns to, do those areas lose their charm? I know that part of the thing that people like about those areas is there's a sense of community, there's a sense of togetherness. But is that so?
Yep. No, I hear you, because impact of resources, when I think of rural areas, the growth of population, of course, will expand those city hubs in those rural areas. What drives this concentration of population is economics and availability for employment and affordability. And what we're seeing, particularly here in the South, that there is housing is becoming so expensive that it is now folks that are in the low income bracket are moving into the outskirts of city. And so these rural areas are starting to become an option for affordability. Though we're not talking about that right now, but we can talk about one day on how demographics change and the impact on how distribution of resources. But, who is having children? This is the question: is who is having children? Where are they having children? Is this a question we should be asking?
Well,
what do you know about the who?
One of the things that we've seen, statistic-wise, we've seen a drop-off in the last 60 years or so in terms of who's having children, right? So when we look at the numbers from a statistical standpoint, we see that in the 1960s, the average family size was anywhere from 2 to 3 children, while as the last time I saw some statistics, 2017, the average family size is to 1 or 2 child max per family in the U.S. So we've seen a decrease of a child to almost 2 children, depending on the type of family here in the U.S. in the 2000s or in the teens. So going back to the point that we were talking about, our families are getting smaller as the decades go on, and we've been seeing this trend for many years.
Yes. There's actually a movie that I watched a while back, and the movie was showing how population growth needed to be intentional. So it happened that, it was supposed to be 60 years from now. And what you had is a population they said it was dumber and dumber because the people who were having children were not high performing families. And so those families were having the highest number of kids. And so the population just kept losing intellectual capacity and our IQ kept declining. Which I thought it was hilarious. It did give me a perspective on who is having children. Outside of race is this a thing that we should be thinking about if we needed to regulate how many, who has the right to give birth and how many births they have a right for.
Something that you mentioned in regulating birth and things like that, some of these concepts come about and I think to myself, do these concepts come about from a standpoint of looking at it of a minority standpoint? So what we've seen over the last couple of decades, I gave some of those numbers just a few minutes ago, but what we've seen is the minority communities are tracking to still have more children than when we consider the majority, which is the white Anglo-Saxon typical American family, right? So are these conversations of regulating families to maintain power within a social structure that's been the United States for over 200 plus years? Or is this from a standpoint of actual resources and things like that? That's a question that I ask myself, and we can make a telenovela about that. Because
that's a great movie.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what the real intentions are behind some of those motives.
Absolutely, but let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll be right back.
That segment of the Latinx Point of View podcast was brought to you by L5 Consultants, a company committed to helping bridge cultural differences. You can find them on Twitter at L5 Consultants or on the web at l5online.com.
Yes, so I love the points that you're making, and it keeps coming back to me, this regulation, and I don't know, I didn't want to go too deep on this topic on regulation because there's the other side of the coin, which is infertility and the taboo of infertility. Now, we have been more used lately to hear people in what they call it, fertilization treatments to have children. So you have a population who is having too many, for somebody's opinion, not mine, too many children, and another group of people who are actually childless. And this comes up as a huge, the significant shift in our population growth as people having to look for alternative ways to give birth. And even if you don't give birth, adoption itself costs about $5,000 to $30,000